So yeah, I misunderstood the task. I'm just presenting a poster, but I did feel it would be helpful to like talk through a little bit. In terms of time limit, maybe like 5 minutes.
Okay.
I don't want to, bore everyone. So yeah, I'll just start. So hello, my name is Adriana, and the work I'm presenting is actually part of my master's thesis, which was in statistics. So excuse that just off the bat if there's something that you don't, understand, I'm happy to explain. So really what this all started from was this project that I was participating in Rwanda during my college career. And so what we were doing is collecting data, qualitative data around how like people were using contraceptives. Because in Rwanda, there's an increase in contraceptive usage rate and a decrease in TFR over the past couple of decades. That's pretty significant when compared to the rest of the region. And so we tried to ground our qualitative work in some data. And what you're seeing here is the data part of that. And so what we did was as we were doing the qualitative work, we found there was this theme of empowerment. So women were reporting feeling empowered. And we thought that was kind of interesting and worth looking into a little more. And so when we went into the data, we were using DHS data, and we saw that the DHS has actually a measure of women's empowerment. And it's a pretty basic measure. What they do is they just look at how people respond to a series of questions. And the questions are mostly in 2 categories. So one is attitudes towards violence. For example, how justifiable is it for a husband to beat his wife if she, say, burns the food? And the second one is decision-making. So does a woman have control over, when they go visit her family, or when she goes to the health center, or other things that she may or may not have, control over decision-making within? And so we kind of used the sample of the DHS data that incorporates kind of these couple responses. So situations where we had the men and the women's response. And so we did that first because we wanted to also measure a difference in childbearing preferences, which is pretty important when we look at contraception. So empowerment as it refers to contraception, we're kind of looking at these 2 domains, attitudes towards violence and decision-making. And we started to incorporate these other things, such as disagreement within the couple about how many children they wanted to have and seeing whose opinion kind of prevailed over time. And to cut to the chase, the literature showed that this empowerment measure that the DHS was using was not applicable to a lot of settings. So we wanted to specifically zero in on Rwanda and do a factor analysis to see how this empowerment measure weighed out. And what we tended to find was that there are really 2 main factors at play that are underlying a bunch of observable characteristics, including education, labor force participation, decision-making, responses, attitudes towards violence, number of children desired, and eventually we tried to then, based on that, predict contraceptive use and contraceptive met need. And so we found that the 2 main underlying factors were 1, attitude towards violence, and 2, decision-making. We then kind of incorporated these 2 factors. We estimated the value of each of these factors for each of the women in our sample set. And then we also looked at a couple of other variables, including education, whether or not the woman was working, the number of children that she had already, and the childbearing preference difference. And we found that these 4 variables plus the decision-making factor were significant in predicting whether contraceptive need was met within our population. And so this is kind of interesting because in the past, a lot of literature has shown that attitudes toward violence would predict contraceptive use, and really a whole host of variables and outcomes. So we didn't see that in any of our analysis. We saw really this factor, our estimated factor for decision-making was the thing that predicted, alongside these other variables, that predicted contraceptive use. And I feel like that's already really long for a poster, so maybe I should stop talking now. Any questions? Questions, feedback? I need feedback because I'm not great at poster presentations. I feel like it's very frustrating, so.
So I think for post presentation is great. Like it's the whole goal is to pull people in and then lots of people just ask you questions, ask you details. The only thing I would say is I imagine your poster will be about this size. It is really hard to see any of the words. You may want to, if you haven't already sent it to the printers, you may want to consider. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Also along those lines, I don't know if I'm missing it, but I don't see your name anywhere on this poster.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that
Sounds
is
good.
obviously something you need to.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
You have, there are different ways of presenting a poster, and some people will just want to stand in front of it and go through and then ask questions. Sometimes they will, can you ask you to go to your spiel? But then that would have to be only just very short, just a few minutes, and then let the person read through. But I mean, I think the way you presented it here, that's.
Cool, so make the font bigger, add my name, let people decide if they want the spiel.
I think it's useful often to be a little aggressive. Someone's sort of looking at you and you say, let me tell you.
Yeah.
And along those lines, just to add to what Jared said, to have sort of like an elevator speech, you know, like what's the one thing, if you have one sentence or two? Because people oftentimes, you know, they stop and they don't have, you know, they'll be walking around. So if you have two take home messages, what would those be? You know, like you prepare for that. In the aggressiveness.
She's been working on that for years.
Alright, well, that's all I got.
Thank you.
So-
All right. Yeah, the next speaker is supposed to be Michael, and he's supposed to be online, but I don't see him online.
Meaning of stop sharing this.
He's-
And who's coming across?
But it's not
He's not
connected.
here yet.
It's not here.
Well, let me just stop. So when you're done with your particular presentation, you can stop sharing. Close your own presentation, and then who are you bringing up next?
So I think we're gonna switch to.
I did not because I didn't have it. But thank you. This-
I'm gonna go outside. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So Emily, how much time have you been? 15.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Nice.
Okay.
Lucky
Very-
people dropped out
very
for my
fun.
session.
Very fun. So. Okay.
I told her about this.
To minimize the, like the video so we can see here.
So. Okay, so we'll give you 15 minutes and then 5 minutes for discussion.
Okay, hi everyone. I am presenting a work in progress titled How Sexual Orientation and Parental Status Shape Economic Inequality Within Couples in the United States. Both the paper and this presentation is a work in progress, so I look forward to your feedback. And this project aims to understand economic outcomes of heterosexual and lesbian, bisexual, and queer couples and how these outcomes vary by parental status. Again, I look forward to your suggestions. LGBTQ populations are growing in the United States. As of 2021, 7.1% of adults identify as LGBTQ, which is a 3.5 percentage point increase from 2012. And there's been a similar growth in LGBTQ couples and LGBTQ couples raising children. So Census 2010 estimates show that about 70% of the approximately 650,000 same-sex couples living in the United States at the time were raising children. And 2019 American Community Survey data estimates found over 1 million same-sex couples in the United States, and roughly 20% of those couples are raising children. And female same-sex couples are more likely than male same-sex couples to have children in the home. My study aims to contribute a better understanding of this growing population of minoritized couples by examining how female same-sex couples specialize in paid work and how specialization varies by parental status. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to this group as lesbian, bisexual, or queer couples, or LBQ couples for short. Existing research on economic inequality for couples with and without children has long overlooked sexual minorities, often explicitly focusing on heterosexual couples or implicitly generalizing findings to all couples. It is well documented that specialization in paid and unpaid work within heterosexual couples increases at the onset of parenthood in distinctively gendered ways. Studies comparing LBQ and heterosexual couples show that LBQ couples have lower levels of income inequality and are more likely to have 2 full-time working partners than heterosexual couples. But much remains unknown about how these patterns vary by parental status. Research in Nordic countries, however, has addressed income inequality within LBQ couples by parental status. These studies find increases in within-couple inequality after the birth of a child for both couple types, but the magnitude and duration of inequality is significantly greater for heterosexual couples and LBQ couples. In light of these lingering questions, I seek to understand how within-couple economic inequality differs both between and within LBQ and heterosexual couples by parental status. I contribute to the literature in 2 primary ways. First, I examine 3 axes of paid work inequality within LBQ and heterosexual couples: income, hourly wages, and hours worked. These measures serve as proxies for relative bargaining power, the relative opportunity cost of spending an additional hour in paid work, and relative time availability within a couple, respectively. Second, I examine the mechanisms driving inequalities within couples by testing how sociodemographic, family, geographic, occupation, and couple homogamy explain paid work inequality by sexual orientation and parental status. I use 2015 to 2019 American Community Survey data and identify heterosexual couples and LBQ couples using the ACS spouse locator that identifies where a respondent's married or unmarried partner is located on the household roster. I restrict my sample to LBQ and heterosexual couples where both partners are 25 to 54 years old, and in supplementary analyses, changing this distribution. These specifications yield a sample of about 1.5 million heterosexual couples and 14,000 LBQ couples. I estimate couple-level economic inequalities with 3 dependent variables: differences in partners' incomes, hourly wages, and hours worked. Hourly wages are weeks and hours worked adjustments of income. All 3 of these measures are calculated by taking the absolute value of the difference between partners' incomes, hourly wages, or hours worked, and these dependent variables are log transformed by taking the natural log of partners' differences plus 1, so we can get those zeros in the model. My 2 primary independent variables are parental status, defined as the presence of a biological, adopted, or stepchild under 18 in the home, and the sexual orientation of the couple. To understand the mechanisms that shape couple-level economic inequality, I test the extent to which sociodemographic, family, geographic, occupation, and couple homogamy explains variation in paid work specialization by sexual orientation and parental status. I'm going to give a brief overview of the variables I use, but I'm happy to talk about them more in the Q&A. Sociodemographic explanatory variables include the couple's highest level of education, race, the mean of both partners' ages, and the couple's marital status. Family explanatory variables include binary indicators for whether the couple has a child under 6 years old in the home, whether the couple had a child within the last year, and if any of the couple's children are stepchildren or adopted children. Geographic explanatory variables include an indicator for whether the couple lives in a metropolitan area and a state level of measure of heteropatriarchy. I'm not going to go exactly into how I create that measure, but I basically use Everett and colleagues' 2022 demography paper as a guideline for how to do that. Occupational explanatory variables include the highest level of occupational prestige within a couple, 2 workplace inflexibility measures, and both partners' occupation groups. I use Song and Shee's occupational percentile rankings of 2010 census occupation codes by birth cohort, and I use both of Ishizuka and Music's measures of workplace inflexibility, so which is the proportion of workers in an occupation that work 40+ hours weekly and occupation. Finally, homogamy explanatory variables include an indicator for educational homogamy and a continuous measure of partners' age differences to capture age homogamy. And I consider a couple educationally homogamous if both partners have the same level of education. I use OLS log linear regression models to estimate within couple differences in income, wages, and hours worked by sexual orientation and parental status. I do two separate analyses of in both analyses, I start with an empty model that regresses each dependent variable on an interaction between sexual orientation and parental status with year fixed effects included. Then in each subsequent model, I add additional explanatory variables. For example, my second set of analyses add socio-demographic variables, including the couple's highest level of education, race, marital status, and the ages of both partners to the model. Then the third model adds family explanatory variables, including whether a couple has a child under 6 in the home, if the couple had a child in the last year, and if the couple has a step or adopted child in the home. And then my fully specified model, model 6, will include all socio-demographic, child, geographic, workplace, and homogamy explanatory. The final model for my first set of analyses can be written as follows, where Y is the difference in partners' income, wages, or hours worked, and beta 4 is a vector of socio-demographic, family, geographic, occupation, and homogamy explanatory variables. And these are measured at the couple level, state level, or occupational level. And then in my second set of analyses, I account for heterogeneity and how these explanatory variables may shape couple inequality by sexual orientation. And so I interact this beta 5 coefficient with couple type. All right, I'm going to start by showing some descriptive statistics, both between and within heterosexual and LBQ couples by parental status. And for the sake of time, I'm going to show you kind of one measure for each of these like mechanism groups. So panel A shows descriptive statistics for heterosexual couples, and panel B shows descriptive statistics for LBQ couples. I plot couples without children in darker colors and couples with children in lighter colors. In blue, I show the percent of heterosexual and LBQ couples with at least one of their own biological step or adopted child under 18 in the home. So 67% of heterosexual couples and 36% of LBQ couples have a child under 18 in the home. In green, I plot the percent of couples where at least one partner has a college degree. Heterosexual couples are less likely than LBQ couples to have one college-educated partner. Heterosexual couples with children are slightly more likely than heterosexual couples without children to have one college-educated partner, indicating some level of positive education selection, and the opposite is true among LBQ couples. As expected, LBQ couples are far more likely than heterosexual couples to have an adopted child under 18 in the home. LBQ couples are more likely to live in cities than heterosexual couples, and LBQ couples without children are less likely to live in a city than with children. Heterosexual couples with and without children are similarly likely to have at least one partner working in a job with a high level of occupational prestige. LBQ couples without children are more likely than LBQ couples with children to have at least one partner working in a job with a high level of occupational prestige. And finally, heterosexual couples are slightly more likely than LBQ couples to be educationally homogamous. Educational homogamy does not vary here by parental status. So given these descriptive differences both within and between LBQ and heterosexual couples, it's likely that these mechanisms will explain within couple inequality differently for these two couple types. Now on to my main results. So figure 2 shows differences in within couple income, hourly wages, and hours worked inequality by sexual orientation. These estimates come from my first model, which only adjusts for year of interview. I have back transformed all of the plotted coefficients, so the y-axis can be interpreted as the percent difference in within couple economic inequality for LBQ and heterosexual couples. For example, LBQ couples have 30% lower within couple income inequality than heterosexual couples. This is consistent with prior literature. Hourly wage inequalities appear to drive the lower income inequalities more than hours worked inequalities for LBQ couples relative to heterosexual couples. Now I'm going to show you results for within couple income inequality between heterosexual and LBQ couples and within these couples by parental status. Panel A shows a percent difference in income inequality for heterosexual couples with children versus heterosexual couples without children. Panel B reports these estimates for LBQ couples. Each bar I show will correspond to the models I outlined earlier. Darker bars will show results from my first set of analyses, and lighter bars will show results from my second set of analyses where I interact explanatory variables by couple type. These blue bars show results for my first model, which only adjusts for year of interview. These coefficients can be interpreted as a percent difference in within couple income inequality between couples with children and couples without children. For example, heterosexual couples with children have 35% higher within couple income inequalities than heterosexual couples without children. And LBQ couples with children also have higher within couple income inequalities than LBQ couples without children. and the difference in income inequalities between heterosexual and LBQ couples by parental status is not significant. After adjusting for sociodemographic explanatory variables, the estimated difference between LBQ and heterosexual couples with and without children is slightly greater. And the lighter green bars account for heterogeneity and how sociodemographic explanatory variables explain within couple income inequality, and this does not change Model 2 results. Adjusting for family characteristics explains some of the income inequality differences within heterosexual and LBQ couples by parental status. This is consistent with what we know about mothers pulling back from the labor force to care for young children. Interestingly, when we account for variation by sexual orientation, we no longer observe a gap in income inequalities between LBQ couples with children and LBQ couples without children. So if you remember, family explanatory variables include whether a couple's youngest child is less than 6 years old, whether a couple had a child within the last year, and whether the couple has an adopted or stepchild in the home. The addition of these indicators to the model means that the orange plotted coefficients are now only measuring the association between having a biological child older than 6 and less than 18 in income inequality. Therefore, the differences between LBQ couples with and without children are driven entirely by LBQ couples without biological children or non-birthing LBQ parents. Among heterosexual couples, occupational characteristics further explain some of the association between parental status and couple income inequalities. Geography, occupation, and homogamy do not further explain the association between parental status and couple income inequalities for LBQ couples. Figure 4 shows estimated couple level differences in hourly wages for heterosexual and LBQ couples and how they vary by parental status. The patterns here are very similar to what we just saw for income inequalities. Family and occupational characteristics partially explain the association between parental status and hourly wage inequalities for heterosexual couples. Again, adding the interactive family explanatory variables reveals that differences in wage inequalities between LBQ couples with and without children are driven entirely by couples without biological children. Differences between heterosexual couples with and without children continue to be driven by the presence of biological children. Finally, figure 5 shows estimated couple level differences in hours worked for heterosexual and LBQ couples and how they vary by parental status. The patterns for heterosexual couples are very consistent with income and hourly wage results. For LBQ couples, however, the addition of family explanatory variables without sexual orientation interactions explains the association between parental status and hours worked inequalities within LBQ couples. To conclude, consistent with previous literature, I find that LBQ couples have lower levels of economic inequality than heterosexual couples. Hourly wage inequalities appear to be the driver of this finding for LBQ couples relative to heterosexual couples. I find considerable heterogeneity in within couple economic inequality by parental status. For heterosexual couples, my findings are consistent with research showing that parenthood increases paid work specialization. I found larger gaps in economic inequality for LBQ couples with children than LBQ couples without children, but these differences were explained by family characteristics. In fact, I found that larger inequalities within LBQ couples with children are not attributable to LBQ couples with biological children, birthing LBQ couples. Future analyses will continue to explore associations between parental status and economic inequalities for families with step and adopted children. I also plan to explore exact matching to account for sample size differences and differential selection by sexual orientation. I look forward to your comments and suggestions.
We're going on time. All right, 5 minutes of questions.
Yes.
Could you show figure 2, please?
Yeah.
When I saw it first, I wasn't quite sure about. I guess I had a need for the word inequality.
Okay.
So that one can understand it without your verbal discussion.
Okay.
Very minor point.
The first model you say is an empty model, but then you said you did control for something. So what is the empty model?
Well, it adjusts for year of interview, but that's the only control in the model. So would it be just year adjusted?
Yeah, I would put
Okay.
something like that because somebody walking into the presentation halfway through is gonna wonder what it is. So I would say what you actually control for.
Okay.
Because empty sounds like there are no controls,
You can call it baseline.
like a baseline model.
Okay.
Or just year, you know, baseline
Yeah.
year adjusted.
Okay.
But So what do you end up?
Just aesthetically, I really liked the way you incrementally introduced your bars. I think your legends should be a little bit bigger. Just because they're so crucial to like kind of like matching and understanding the results as you introduce your colors. I think if you could make that the size of the legends larger, that would be really helpful
Okay, thank you.
for the audience.
You might want to consider not showing results for all three
Mm,
dependent variables. I mean, you were right on time, but if you
Yeah.
want to spend more time in the discussion and conclusions, that might be, that might be something you might want to consider. And then two very minor points.
Yeah.
In your first slide, the very first one you were setting up the story,
Mhm.
you showed the trends on the proportion of individuals, right?
Yeah.
But then you continue mentioning couples and couples with children. If you have the same lines,
Yeah.
you
I
don't,
know.
oh, okay.
I-
That would be,
Yeah, I know.
okay, yeah, all right.
Spent a lot of time trying to find that.
For what it's worth, when I presented on trans people in the fall, and in that session, every single presentation started with this picture. So I think it's well known.
Yeah.
If I can add something on this slide,
Yeah.
when you were speaking, you had like more numbers you were citing.
Yeah.
And I found it a bit hard to follow because like I was focusing on the graph and then I was expecting to see the numbers somewhere.
And that's why the having with the,
Yeah.
but if you don't have it, maybe popping those numbers somewhere in this, you know what I mean,
Yeah,
as boxes might be helpful for what, yeah.
In your slide where you show the heterosexual couples and the LGBT couples, what percentage of the total is less than 7%? Your descriptive, your.
Yeah, so it's, this is which is also confusing. So this is all individuals who identify as anything other than heterosexual. And I'm looking here at people who are in couples and identify them with their like sex reported on the census. So this is gonna be lower than like what we think of
Yeah,
as.
but you might wanna say this is refers to couples and among these individuals, it's 7% or something, but of the couples, it's
Yeah,
in proportion.
okay, yeah.
There's a question in the back. What was the age category of persons you were working with?
25 to 54.
You try stratifying the data across age categories, given how couples and families develop over time and may shift in overall income and other variables on their ability to support children?
Yeah, so I've done it where I like expand that or contract it, but I haven't really looked kind of across those different, and the results are consistent across those different specifications, but not necessarily, I haven't looked exactly at like this.
All right, everyone, thank you. So next we're going Michael. Oh, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for inviting me and pinging me when I couldn't find the link. So should I share my slides or? Yeah, let me.
He's
I have my.
unmuted speaking. I'm not sure why we can't hear him.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Um,
Hello?
Because he is unmuted and he looks like he's speaking. Let me see.
I'm definitely speaking.
Right now, Joe.
Yeah, it's not that computer that has audio. It's so active.
Oh, that's the other one.
All right, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hello?
I don't think
Maybe
it's
powerful.
Am I on?
On the screen.
That the joining audio, that will only create an echo because that's for.
Hello? All right, I'm gonna try without AirPods. Let's see.
Can you hear?
He should click.
I can definitely hear you. Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Maybe
Hello?
we can just call him and put him on speakerphone.
Hello? Okay. Maybe I'll try.
Can you try now?
Yeah, I'm trying. Can you hear? Hello? Okay, wait, you can actually hear? Wow, okay. Let's great. So I'm gonna share my slides and then we can get started. Well, thanks for doing this. This is super cool. From such a distance. Yeah. All right, you can hear me?
Yes. Yes.
All right, I'm gonna close the door because I'm at the Max Planck Institute, so I gotta be a little bit.
Michael, you need to share your screen.
Yeah, I'm sharing.
We can't see your slides.
Yeah, I'm sharing.
Okay.
You know?
Great.
Great. Okay, yes, so thank you.
How much time have you been allocated?
Is it full screen?
No.
No.
You're gonna have to choose that option on your end. There you
Yeah,
go.
pretty good, that's pretty good.
That's good.
How much time have you been allocated?
15.
Okay, all right. So.
All right, so so let's get started. So I'm going to be talking about the origins of mass schooling and the elusive rural educational advantage using new data from linked complete count US censuses. And I'm currently a doctoral candidate with the Population Studies Center and Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. So to begin, it's actually not very controversial that the US was a leader in educational expansion before the Civil War. So from 1800 to 1860, there was a variety of Americanist ideologies that supported the expansion of schools, things like nation building. You have to become a citizen, a voter, and participant. All of these things required that you be literate. It was a Protestant country, and Protestantism emphasized the ability to read the Bible. So this was a contributor. Finally, many people who were advocates of mass schooling in the US believed that schooling was important to keep youths off the streets and from committing crimes. However, there's a controversy about why the US education system continued to expand from the postbellum era to the Great Depression. And most researchers in education think that this is unresolved. There's three perspectives on it. One, neo-institutionalism. These scholars argue that the forces that were active in the antebellum period simply continued into the postbellum period. Two, functionalism. People argued basically that the expansion of urban areas, industrialization, increased the returns to schooling. Three, neo-Marxian conflict and critical theories. These were people who believed that urbanization, industrialization created essentially ethnic and class conflict. Schools are used by local elites to manage those conflicts. There's been remarkably little progress on this topic in 21st century sociology, social science, and economics. I found 2 publications on it in the last 25 years, one of which was Golden and Katz's celebrated race between education and technology. What I found fascinating about the topic is that there's something that's quite easily tested, which is something called the urban industrial hypothesis, which is that in the case of the first theory, neo-institutionalism, there's no real expected linkage from urban industrialization to school expansion. However, the other 2 theories, most scholars believe, do predict that such an association should occur, and they believe actually that's causal. But early cross-sectional tests find really no association. They tend to be supportive of the neo-institutional perspective. And even recent work by Golden and Katz also supports that perspective. So I think from a more modern perspective, as someone who's coming at this 20 years, 30 years after these debates took place, it seems that all of these could be operating in different times, places, and contexts. I think Golden and Katz, for instance, if you read their account, it seems to closely align with the nation building and functionalist perspective. I also think that there's a little bit of conceptual confusion because most of these are tests of geographic inequalities and are not necessarily informative about the causal process. So for instance, finding that urban areas have more schooling doesn't necessarily mean that urban areas created more schooling. To give, I think, the last major work on this topic its due, This is the conclusion of by Golden and Katz, studying the expansion of the high school movement using the 1910 and 1920 census rates and school enrollments. They say the fraction of youth attending secondary school decreased with city size. The decrease with the size of city or town, moreover, was monotonic, extending throughout the distribution of cities. The smallest towns, those with populations between 1,000 and 2,500, had higher secondary schooling rates than did towns with populations ranging from 2,500 to 10,000 persons. The largest had the lowest rates of all. The range from the smallest of towns to the largest of the cities, 46% to 21%, a difference of 25 percentage points in 1910. Incredible as it may seem, rates of school attendance were higher still among incorporated rural places with fewer than 1,000 persons, tiny towns, veritable hamlets. So I find this remarkable because when we look at the international evidence, it's almost uniform that urban areas have superior educational outcomes to rural areas. So this is data from UNESCO in 2015. But actually, if you review really any UNESCO report or any report that tries to look at geographic inequalities, they will tell you essentially the same story, that urban areas tend to have more schooling than rural areas. So this paper focuses mainly on the descriptive question about urban and rural inequalities. I leave the causal work for subsequent investigation. And we're really asking, was the US such an outlier? Was there really a rural advantage or size disadvantage in the US, as Golden and Katz claim? There's multiple problems with the previous literature. First, everyone agrees that enrollments are bad. They're not good at actually measuring attainment. They don't necessarily keep track of participation. We can talk more about that later. The second thing is that much of this literature uses state-level statistics rather than individual microdata or even counties. This induces an ecological inference problem. We can talk about that if it's of interest. The third question is, did the rural education advantage in terms of school participation really translate to attainment? A natural hypothesis is that something is kind of going wrong and there's a mismeasurement issue in a lot of this historical literature. So I'm going to be investigating that. The fourth problem is that a lot of the literature is unclear about whether or not the South should be included. So Baker, 1999, in the Sociology of Education says that urbanization is associated with school expansion using enrollments ages 5 to 19 at the state level, but he includes southern states that have huge educational disadvantages among whites and African Americans and low scores on any plausible urbanization index. Finally, Golden and Katz concludes this literature finding that smaller areas in the non-South US had greater attendance, and they interpret this as high social capital in these smaller areas and the spread of the high school movement. So we're going to be using complete count US censuses to sort out the literature. We're going to be documenting urban-rural differences in age-specific school participation propensities using the 1900-1920 complete count censuses. We're going to be looking at place size differentials in schooling, and we're going to finally use the 1940 census, which was the first to record educational attainment in more conventional terms using a highest grade completed measure to investigate rural-urban inequalities. So the organization of the paper is that I propose a summary measure of a regional age-specific school participation propensity. I estimate at the county level, and then I investigate rural, non-rural differences. I investigate age-specific school participation propensity by place size with and without controls, and I do the same thing for median years of schooling. So to give a sense of what our data looks like, it's complete count censuses. So there's everyone who participated in the census, linkable in some cases, and really everyone, whether linkable or not in others. And what I do is I take the entire population of children age 6 to 19, and I follow them until they appear in 1940. And then I ask, how many years of schooling did you complete? I use the IPUM's multi-generational longitudinal panel to investigate this, so I can observe both whether they report that they were participating in schooling, and I can also see how many years of schooling they eventually got. So the first outcome is going to be participation. It's consistently available in complete count censuses used in previous studies. Essentially, you get a 1 if you were participating, and you get a 0 otherwise. That creates an age A-specific school attendance rate in an area. We go beyond previous research, investigating 2-year age groups for individual youths. There's, of course, problems with this measure. Any 1 day of schooling might have been thought by the respondent as counting, night school, specific technical training. Some may have counted apprenticeships. Also, the reference period changes over time, getting shorter and shorter until 1920. And so there's going to be mechanical declines in the measure, even if the actual school attendance stays the same. but it's been used extensively in recent policy work. And so I think that there's a case for using this. The measure that we've constructed for this paper is expected highest grade completed by area. Essentially what I do is I take in a given area Z, all of the age-specific school participation propensities, and I simply sum them for ages 6 through 19. And that's going to give a measure of the expected highest grade completed. The logic is that an individual who attends school in a given year wants to complete a year of school. It has the problems that are inherent to all period measures, the assumption of homogeneity of the population, the stability of the parameters over time. Some individuals will complete more than a year of school per year of participation, others will do less, and we're going to talk about that. But I still think it's very informative to have these kind of measures computed at the county level. We're going to be looking at educational attainment measured using the 1940 decennial census, the first to measure it, and asks about the highest grade completed. We assume that all grades below were completed. This is a picture of what our sample looks like. Really, I just want you to take away that it's in the millions, and then in our linked sample, we have also millions. So everything is going to be statistically significant if it's significant at all. And I'm going to show confidence intervals in the 95% level, but they're going to be essentially very close to the point estimates. The methods we're going to be using are individual level multiple regression analyses to evade the ecological inference problem, essentially using logits of the age A specific attendance propensities and a simple multiple regression on the highest grade attended. Our explanatory variable is going to be a size variable. We're going to have 5 sizes. Rural areas have 1,000 people or less. Areas that are towns have 1,000 to 10,000 people. Small cities are going to be 10,000 to 50,000 people. Medium-sized cities are going to be 50,000 people to 500,000 people. And large cities are going to be those with 500,000 people or not, or more. So think about New York in this period, that would be a large city. LA, I think San Francisco by 1920 is a large city. So now we're going to talk about some of our results. So, I'm sorry?
You have 5 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. So our first result is simply this map of what the propensity measure that we've come up with, the expected highest grade completed, looks like at the county level. And on the bottom part of the graph is actually the years of schooling completed. And the thing that should catch your eye is that across the Midwest, there are many rural areas that we think of as rural that have very high expected highest grade completed measures, and they have surprisingly high mean highest grade completed measures. So you want to be thinking from, say, Indiana all the way out to Iowa. There's this darker shade of blue, and no surprise, when you look at the mean highest grade completed, it's also a darker shade of blue. And these are non-urban areas for the most part. When we look at the southwest of America, Southern California, Southern Nevada, Arizona, again, we see this kind of darker shade on the expected highest grade completed measure, and then we also see a darker shade of blue. So the correlation at the county level in this data is 0.3, which I think is moderate. And so there's some justification for using this measure. The next thing I do is for each census year, I construct the expected highest grade completed measure for ruralities and non-ruralities. I bin it into deciles, and then I look at the number of years completed of school for each decile. And the thing that jumps out at you immediately is that at a given decile, non-rural areas with very similar levels of participation as constructed using our summary measure have much higher years of school completed. So there's almost like more efficiency in the non-rural areas when it comes to converting a given level of school propensity, school participation propensity into years of school completed. Indeed, when we look directly at the age-specific school participation propensities by size, we observe that, and I log these to make the differences a little bit bigger, we observe that from the ages 8 all the way through 13, basically everyone attends school, there's not much size difference. As the ages increase, in 1910 and 1920, people attend school less. This is not surprising. The average school leaving age was 13 to 15 in this period. And what we see is that there's actually a negative slope when it comes to size. So the bigger cities, when we look at the raw data, always have the lowest at ages 15 through 19, and ruralities and towns, there are usually 1 or 2 when it comes to the ranking in the raw data. When we adjust for covariates, actually, the relationship gets a little bit weaker, but not much, and the ruralities fall a little bit, which means that some of their advantage is coming from the fact that rural areas had in some ways demography that was more conducive to attending school in this period. Finally, we look at the mean highest grade completed by size, and what we observe is a stark rural disadvantage, regardless of whether we include covariates or not. So the AAP is our average adjusted prediction. So this is kind of estimating what the years of schooling completed would be if the entire population was a big city or medium-sized city using the models that we've estimated. And what we find is basically that the coefficients don't change that much. And that means also that the predicted years of school completed are not going to change that much by area size, except for one group, which is the big city versus the medium city. The big city, the cities with 500,000 people or more, always look much better after adjusting for demographic covariates, which in this case are going to include foreign-born status, family disruption, a sophisticated measure of class that includes detailed occupational categories, and the region of the country that you're in. This is actually pretty important for determining how many years of school an individual eventually obtained. So to conclude our findings, we replicated Golden and Katz, but the educational achievement advantage implied by attendance statistics is substantially overstated. In particular, rural disadvantage is the norm, and the historical US was really no exception. Other differences by size are small. Large cities' underperformance is substantially driven by observables, including demographics, especially foreign-born status and the children of the foreign-born. Actually, large cities do extremely well after you adjust for this. The rural disadvantage we document robust reweighting, more granular size categories, adjustment for internal migration, and the inclusion of the South. Actually, the large city advantage is also robust to everything except the inclusion of the South, mainly because one city, Baltimore, Maryland, which is included in the South in this data set, performed poorly. So I'd like to thank Penn Population Studies Center, IPUMS, the Institute for Education Sciences, my dissertation committee, and some people have given comments already, and many others. So thank you.
Questions, comments?
Michael, this is Gwen. I have a question on your slide that had the maps. You can go back to that. So for this, you had said what they were and what the differences were between these maps, and then I immediately forgot. And so when you were describing them, I had no idea what I was looking for or looking at. Is there a way that you could add titles to what these differences are in the maps? Maybe you can explain again what the differences are?
Right, I guess so the EHG is the expected highest grade completed measure. So that's this like summary measure that sums all of the age-specific school propensities. And then the mean highest grade completed is the actual years of school that the participants completed when they show up in the 1940 decennial census, based on the county that they're first observed in. And so the point of the maps is actually just that they're very similar. So on some level, the years of school that you would guess just by looking at attendance statistics does correlate moderately with the mean highest grade completed. And then the other observation is that across the Midwest, you see both high levels of school participation and high levels of years of school completed. And that's surprising because these are not urban areas. So this would appear to be evidence actually against the urban industrial hypothesis if you were just to look at the raw correlations. So that's the point of the map.
A comment you've heard me make before, Michael, is you refer often to years of schooling when I believe you mean grades attained. And that leads sometime to nonsensical statements, or I forget exactly how it was said, where you could have more years of schooling in a year than one. But particularly because in at least the early grades, my guess is there's a fair amount of grade repetition. Years are not the same as grades attained, and you shouldn't mix the two up.
Yes, so that is correct, and I've tried to move entirely to mean highest grade completed, and I just say that we assume that they've completed
You
all the
made
lower
big
grades.
steps in the right direction, but you go further and be consistent throughout.
Yeah, yeah.
Michael, at some point, it seems like you excluded the South from all of your analysis or mostly of your analysis, and you might make that clear in the beginning. So
Yes.
it's pertaining mostly to the white population in the US, with
Uh,
scattering of Native Americans.
By the time you get to 1920, the Great Migration has started. So it's still excluding most African Americans. But it's not like you still have samples of African Americans, I think, that are in the millions, or it's very large, actually hundreds of thousands in the linked sample, which means that in the underlying sample, it's actually larger. It's a good point. I do have analyses that include the South, and you just get a little bit different patterns because Baltimore, the city, is a major underperformer in this period. And also other people, when they do analyses like this, they always have to do something about the South. And we have large sample sizes now, so I compute the South and non-South separately, and then I also merge them in the paper itself. So I'm just trying to be consistent with what Golden and Katz did. This was the most recent analysis, and they exclude all
One
this
thing
other.
is try to be clear from the beginning, like these maps that you show exclude the South.
Yes, yes.
I know the US. So
Yes.
you might want to say something about it in the beginning. And also, I mean, the racial composition seems to change over the course, right? So at
Yes,
some point,
absolutely.
you know, when you
But,
finalize the paper, I would like to see the estimate separately for whites and the non-whites.
it's an interesting idea. Yeah, we can do that.
I think it would be important, actually.
Yeah.
Michael, I just want to get back to Gwen's comment. I think I didn't get that. You gave a nice explanation of those maps, but in your presentation, that was not clear to her. It wasn't clear to me either. So my suggestion would be for you to actually, in your first slides, to cut them in at least half, you know, your motivation, so you have more time to really explain and get into your results. So two concrete suggestions. One, when you have your slides with the theories of school expansion, I suggest you go straight into the unresolved controversies, because you don't need to spend too much time into things that have already been settled. So that's one suggestion for you. And then the second is, for example, when you read a quote, I wouldn't read the entire quote. I would leave the quote in the slide and go to take home messages. This way, you free time to really explain, you know, better explain your contributions. And so it would be, you know, we would understand better what the points were. So, yeah, that's it.
Michael, no, this is very interesting. And my suggestion is like to investigate of the demographic controls, what's really the most meaningful one. My guess is the percent foreign born, because a lot of this is, and so maybe if you can stress what reverses the finding. And this connects with something that we're discussing today, the immigration and child labor laws. And for the Mexican population, if you look at the foreign-born Mexican population, 16, 17, 18, they are not attending school. They're not attending high school. And the explanation is because they come to the US after they completed their education. So maybe you can, I think this also connects with discussions we're having today about child labor laws and so forth. And so if you can investigate the demographic sources, it will be interesting. Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I had a really minor, sorry, I had like a really minor, Michael, you had a slide where you like laid out the problems with the literature. And I think your first bullet point was that enrollment's a terrible measure or something. I do think, I don't know this literature at all, but I wonder if there's a more diplomatic way to put that. And I also wonder if you could cite something there, so it doesn't feel so much like an opinion versus like something that's established in terms of.
I very much agree. Enrollment actually is a very good measure of reported enrollment. So it's a question of what you're trying to measure. And if you just said enrollment's not a good measure for learning or whatever you're trying to say, that would be helpful.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
All right. Cheers.
All right, next is Jose. So how much time are you?
I don't wanna move it.
Michael, can you stop sharing? Oh, you have.
Is that when you're close? The team here.
I thought I stopped sharing.
Yeah, I was wrong.
We'll note in the record book.
So, thank you everyone. I'm Jose Silva, second year PhD at Penn, and I'll be presenting on this paper in collaboration with Eugenio and Anneliese and Julio from Eugenio. We're visiting the rise and fall of excess and mortality. So, as known for here we'll be using exchangeably excess and mortality as a synonym for the neuromortality method, which has been broadly documented like in animal populations, especially mammals, and also in every single large country since the 2000s. And this advantage comes in high-income countries since the 18th, 19th centuries and extends to most causes of death and age. So there are two main realms of explanation for those, for this advantage. So one is the biological and genetic explanations that states about the role of males being more prone to infection than females. And this is supported by evidence from higher risk of males having bad neonatal outcomes than females, and some estimates from adult populations, from foster populations, that they try to minimize these biological factors, these external factors, and account for the biological factors. So in the social behavior and cultural environmental factors, which I mentioned as external factors, these is something very striking for adulthood, like mortality differential especially, so cigarette smoking, alcohol consumption, occupational hazards. And in under 5 mortality, you have the case of female infanticide, which is the case in some countries. So as you see, the adult mortality differentials, already documented, the major role here is of external factors. In under 5, we have a mix between biological and behavioral. As we go, in earlier ages, you get closer to the biological factors, to exclude the biological factors. And the importance of doing of studying the early period due to the consequences of the early period for adulthood, and to kind of disentangle and grasp a little bit more about the biological factors. So as a background, this picture we show the sex ratio of under 5 mortality, probability of dying between 0 and 5, for the 10 countries we'll be analyzing here. And here, I just put for you the mean curve to see kind of the rise and fall that have been documented in previous papers. So until around 1960s and 70s, you see a rise in the sex ratios. So a larger disadvantage for males, and then starting to decline afterwards. So the idea of this paper is to examine this documented rise and fall, and to take a more detailed look at the age and sex-specific contributions for the mortality decline in this period, or the changes in the sex ratios. So a few studies have broadly documented these age breakdowns, below age 1 especially. And these analyses can offer insights about the proposed hypothesis for this. So we are using here the under 5 mortality database that's given over there. This database consists of like 8 specific mortality rates and probabilities of dying by 22 detailed ages. So we have like age breakdowns by weeks, months, trimesters, and consists of like high quality vital registration data for 25 countries. Mostly like they are from 1841, 2016, and we are selecting here these 10 countries basically for data availability. We have here the 25, and I'm highlighting here the 10. And the idea is to have some information at least since 1930s, so we can kind of follow the rise and fall process. So in these countries, they're all high-income countries, they have low under 5 mortality rates. And as we go to lower under 5 mortality rates, we have the role of exerted mortality. And also we have yearly estimates here, which will make our sex ratio trends very irregular. So the idea to account for both of these cases is to construct 10-year pooled estimates. And we'll be also doing a Monte Carlo simulation for estimating this uncertainty. We are assuming here that the depths will follow a Poisson distribution. And here, as I told before, the rate I'm using the probability of dying between ages 0 and 5. The assumption we make to calculate this is a constant force of mortality between these narrow age groups. And we calculate the sex ratios as the ratio of males to females probability of dying. And then in the next step, we'll be decomposing differences in sex ratios into age and sex specific components. So we'll have components for each of these age groups of males and females, which can be seen here. So decompose the differences across each of these decades to have the contribution of females and of males. Even in the context that both of them are declining, we expect that the contributions of females to the sex ratio is to make it like higher. And males also decline in mortality, so expect them to work in different direction. So here you see like the contributions of males as positive and of females as positive and of males as negative. And for that decomposition, we use the general continuous change method. So here we see the trend in under 5 mortality rates for these 10 countries. We see from like the 1900s and beyond, males are always on top. They have higher mortality rates for all of these countries and have like a very sharp decline in other 5 mortality. Here I'm showing the absolute differences in these mortality rates over here. So you can see that as they decline, as expected, like they get closer to each other, like that in absolute values. So males are catching up with females in a sense, in absolute terms, you can say. And here we see the sex ratios by country. So it's similar to the first picture I showed of the trends, but country specific, and I plot also here the confidence intervals we estimated. So you can see that we have a very clear rise and fall in some countries like Italy, United States, or Denmark. But in all others, not so much. And we can see very broad confidence intervals here. So for Italy and United States, we see a rising until 1960s, approximately, and then a fall afterwards. And in the decomposition exercise, and here we show in these dots, we see the absolute differences of the sex ratios. So here we have pre-1960s and post-1960s. So here we're showing the difference in sex ratio in 1960s minus the sex ratio of the first period available. So for example, if it's England, which has 1900s data available, it's 1960 minus 1900. And the actual difference would be 0.15, let's say. And then we see pre-1960, most of countries had a rise in the ratio. That's why you see positive values. And post-1960s, in most of them, we see the decline, the fall. But what is striking here is that for the rise period, we see a major contribution of ages above 6 months, especially ages 1 to 5 years. And for the fall period, we see a major contribution of the 0 to 7 days. And then in summary, like what our results show is that the rise and fall might not be as universal as like previously thought, especially given the uncertainty in very low mortality scenarios. And when we decompose the rise, like the previous hypothesis for that is that we have like a greater male disadvantage for perinatal conditions, which is the case when as deaths decline, as like mortality declines, deaths get concentrated in the initial ages, and you have a decline in 1 to 4, so the sex ratio increase due to these disadvantage in the perinatal conditions. But our findings actually suggest that this rise is mostly due to a female advantage in the mortality decline above 6 months. And one potential explanation we will explore further in next steps is like the parent behavior factors or more gender equality through time in this context. And for the fall decomposition, the previous hypothesis suggests like a male perinatal catching up hypothesis, which is actually supported by what we find. And yeah.
You were actually 2 minutes, right? Okay. Questions?
In your introduction, I wasn't sure, most of your analysis is undefined, well, all your analysis is undefined mortality, so the motivation, I would focus on undefined mortality.
Okay.
Why is there sex difference in undefined mortality, not about adult behaviors, right?
Okay.
And then say understanding undefined mortality may be important for implications for aging, but I would focus, it took me a while to realize you focused on undefined, and I knew you did because I know one. But I might not have otherwise. So I would focus, why is it that is that sex difference in undefined?
Okay.
So that was one of my comments. And I wasn't surprised of the contribution of the 0 to 7-day-olds in the end of the period. There's a lot of technological things that happens after 1960s, and preterm babies, for example, saved in the early period. So not just behaviors, but I think it's going to be technology that may have been more beneficial for the male babies than, maybe they had more. So if you look at some of the Ingrid Waldron, who was a colleague of ours, who focused on sex differences in mortality, I think she focused a lot on the early neonatal period. And I think that's where the technology may have made a big contribution for reducing that gap, since most of it seems to be driven by that. So I might at least think about your explanations for the fall, to be say a little bit more about the fall.
Okay.
You focus on the rise, but I think the fall. Anyway.
On the first bullet point on your conclusion, it seems to me very strange to make a statement about universality based on a study which considers less than 10% of the world's population. You might want to say under 5 mortality in high-income countries.
Yeah.
But you're looking at a tiny proportion of children.
I know we've got this, but I'm saying that it might be advantageous to spend a little bit more time with this rise and fall initial article that you all trying to evaluate much further, including stating the hypothesis that came out of that article, which you are going to be able to revisit with this additional information.
So do that like previously rather than in the conclusion.
Yeah, it comes very quickly. I don't think we even cite that article.
That's really this one. But
I mean, in the beginning.
Yeah.
In the beginning. And that's really one of the main motivations of the article. So I think this needs to to be shown a little bit more. And then it gives you, it gives you more meat for because at the end, we're really interested in these hypotheses and these behaviors. So I think the audience will be already geared towards, okay, this is what's been found, and we're able to evaluate this hypothesis a little bit more.
And then that's focus the introduction to under five.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, the motivation, you need some, you start with is it biology, is it social, stuff like that. Listen, if it's biological, you will expect no variation across space and time. If it's like, so maybe you can play with something like that, including, the way you present your results, the cross country, the overtime, or stuff like that. They all question the biological. And so maybe you can highlight that in light of the hypothesis.
Okay, thank you. This is Gwynne. Our package. Our package. It's another package. Yeah. I use them.
Are not saying I keep going over the allocated.
Okay.
So I have been trying to cut down, so my first couple slides don't necessarily match. Actually, they talk about things, but if there are things you think that you feel that I can cut out, please tell me because I need to cut more out.
How much time are you giving?
Oh.
Well.
Independent from my. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my presentation on factors explaining disability disparity between the American Indian Alaska Native population and Bridged Office of Management and Budget, OMB, racial ethnic population. My name is Gwynne Evans-Lomiesta. I'm a Hopi tribal member and a PhD demography student at the University of Pennsylvania. All right, so my research, the American Indian Alaska Native population tend to have the highest disability rate among the OMB race ethnic categories. However, a lot of research that examines these racial disparities for disability don't include the American Indian Alaska Native population in the analysis. Little is known about the factors associated with it. So my research aims to delve into this and find a little bit more about this. All right, for purposes of my research, I am using the OMB race category. This is not the same as the jurisdictional population, and this is just important to keep in mind as we go through the results. For a little bit of context of the size of the American Indian Alaska Native population, in the 2000 census, 9.7 million people identified as American Indian Alaska Native, either alone or in combination with at least one other race. All right. So of the research that does exist and does look into the American Indian Alaska Native disability, it's primarily focused on ages 65 and older. But in those studies, increasing age, being female, and having a lower educational attainment were all associated with increased disability for the population. Analyses into spatial segregation for education disability in the American Indian Alaska Native population found that significant educational disparities compared to the white population persisted whether or not people were in metropolitan areas or on tribal land. Educational attainment is often linked to increased or to disability rates and comes with advantages such as income and access to healthcare, and also has been identified as leading to behaviors for healthier outcomes. Additionally, to keep in mind through all this, the American Indian Alaska Native population is a very young population. And so by focusing these analyses on 65 plus, you're also missing a huge variation of the population in these factors. All right, geographic isolation is one of the major reasons that people often cite as potentially associated with these disparities. Many tribal lands are often geographically isolated and very rural in nature, which may lead to limited access to healthcare. And most American Indian Alaska Natives in the data set do live on these rural tribal lands. Research has also identified that folks who have increasing numbers of disabilities, so more than one, often have delayed healthcare access, and this may be leading to those higher numbers of disabilities. Health insurance is often used in these as a proxy for that healthcare access. This is important as I also used healthcare or health insurance as a proxy for this healthcare access. Finally, the American Indian Alaska Native population have among the highest percent of their population in the US military. A Veterans Affairs report confirmed that the American Indian Alaska Natives experience the highest rate of disability among their veterans and are also least likely to have health insurance. So because of all of these together, I have chosen to look at the age distribution, health insurance as a proxy for healthcare access, education, the remoteness of tribal lands, and military service as potential likely explanatory factors of this increased disability for the American Indian Alaska Native population. So my data uses the Census Bureau's 5-year American Community Survey estimates from 2015 to 2019. This is downloaded from IPUMS. I specifically look at adults of working ages between age 25 to 64. I also restrict my sample to only those who had responses to all of the variables of interest. So this limits my analytic sample to 8 million. And you can see here the race distribution for my predicted races. Now I do use bridge race data created by IPUMS for this analysis. The bridged race data is what the likely single race choice would have been if they couldn't choose more than one. This is important as this increases my American Indian Alaska Native sample size because almost half of the American Indian Alaska Native population identifies with 2 or more race categories. So my research first establishes the pattern of disability by racial ethnic groupings. Then I look at what factors shape disability among the groups. And finally, I look at the social context of the American Indian Alaska Native population that may further shape this disability risk. So here I have plotted the period age-specific disability rates for adults aged 25 to 64. These are all weighted, but as you can see through every single age grouping, the American Indian Alaska Native population in blue continues to have much higher rates than any other population. I then standardized this to the US national average age distribution to better compare the different disability rates. Here you can still see that the American Indian Alaska Native population continues to be much higher than the other populations. I had also decomposed this in the analysis. It's not shown here, I can later if people have questions, to determine whether or not the age distribution of the population or the rate by age were the contributing factors to this difference. So for the analysis of comparing these different populations together, I conduct a series of logistic regression models. I use disability as my outcome variable, as either they have one of the 6 or more than one of the 6 disabilities. And then I do control for census region, so the geographic distribution, the survey year, and the gender. All right, this is the series of regression models with odds ratios that I use, gradually adding on my different explanatory variables to see how they interact. Here I have plotted the odds ratios for at least one disability by predicted rate. And you can continue to see through this one that all of these remain significant. They're very tiny, but I do have the confidence intervals here. And you can see that the American Indian Alaska Native population continues to have much higher odds for disability risk, even with all of these added. All right, so here I have the final model. This is with all of my explanatory variables added. These are generally what we would expect to see given the background literature of patterns explaining increased disability. So as people age, disability increases, or the risk of disability increases. The one that was surprising was health insurance. This leads to decreased, or in the data, it showed decreased odds for disability risk. So next I stratified by race ethnicity group to really get a better understanding of how these different variables are interacting by race, to understand whether or not they're interacting the same or if different variables are responding to the race separately. So let's take a closer look at the explanatory variables. We can again generally see that the pattern we would expect holds, although what's surprising here is you will see for education, the lowest level, as well as military service, the American Indian Alaska Native population in blue is not as high as the other groups, which I would have expected it to be much higher to explain some of this difference. Further, what's really surprising is that we go further in and look at the role of tribal lands on these odds ratios for disability. We'll see that for all racial groupings except for American Indian Alaska Native, you have increased odds, but then it's lower for the American Indian Alaska Native population, which is contrary to what we would have believed through the literature. So I take a closer look specifically at the American Indian Alaska Native population on tribal lands and off tribal land groups. And here we can see a little bit more of the differences. The population on tribal lands is in red, without tribal lands is in blue. Everything generally remains statistically significant with the exception of I added Indian Health Services to this regression. And this was added because I thought perhaps this might explain a little bit more healthcare access of that those on tribal lands, maybe this is where they get their healthcare access or don't have it. However, it is not significant for the population on tribal lands. It's only significant for the population off tribal lands. So in conclusion, a lot more research needs to be done to understand this increased disabilities with the American Indian Alaska Native population. There are a lot more mechanisms other than had been predicted by some of the background literature that are contributing to this. I'm not sure why insurance and Indian Health Services didn't play a role as much for these differences. But this does go to show that we don't know very much about disability risk for the American Indian Alaska Native population. All right, so thank you so much.
Right on time.
I rushed.
Right on time. Okay. Questions?
Yeah, Katelyn.
For health insurance, maybe I missed this in the beginning, but did you consider the role of Social Security disability insurance where there's some situations where if you have a disability that makes you eligible for Medicare?
So these are all self-identified disabilities. It's not whether or not a doctor has actually established anything, but insurance coverage covers any type of insurance.
Yeah, I'm saying having a disability would make you eligible for insurance in some situations. So that might be why
Could
you see
explain
that
why.
relationship.
Also wonder if that's like tied to age in some way, where like younger people are more likely to go without insurance just because they're less at risk of maybe needing it if they can't afford it in some way. I don't know if that's true, but I'm wondering if that could explain.
I can verify, I don't think that's true for the American Indian Alaskan natives. It seemed to be pretty distributed across all ages, which was unexpected.
No, a couple of comments. You might, I mean, the foreign born always, for Hispanics and Asians, so you might want to think about just looking at US born population, because also American Indians are by definition just US born. And
And then it can include some foreign born. I did try it with US born and then I panicked and I went back to it.
I think for, if you're gonna compare across groups, you might want to just think about the US born or construct the groups different. You can have white native, white foreign born, you can have more groups. But for the easiest thing is to just go with US born. Now, show me your last result. That was the previous one, yeah. Am I reading this right? That this is, it seems to me that the biggest story that you have is residence in a tribal land or not. Is that your biggest finding, that this varies? Look at the effect of age. And you have 30, it's always Puma without tribal land, they have lower odds than improvements in tribal lands.
Yeah,
Is that it? It seems to me that's your main finding.
the tribal.
It seems, I don't know, I was looking at your conclusions and trying to see what's the main finding, and I thought you were going to make an emphasis on whether you're residing in a tribal land or not, because it seems that way, that's what I see I see a difference there for age, or not.
For age, but for tribal lands themselves, the American Indian Alaska Natives have lowered.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying, so you have lower, oh, here you have
Yeah,
lower.
but that's because maybe the people who are not Native Americans who live on tribal lands are unique group.
Yeah, so first, you know, you have how many,
Well, so.
Yeah, this
I
Very
should-
hard to understand.
I should, no, no, no.
I'm sorry.
You're right. I should have been more clear on defining what this is, because I'm looking at pumas with tribal land and without. So this can include any puma that has at least one census block on tribal land. This does include a lot of areas also that maybe only have a little bit of a census block of tribal. So this includes, it's not perfect proxy, but it's the best. Okay.
so you have lower odds here, and then when you do the model, you have by age, you have higher odds. The red dots are in tribal land or something. I wonder if there's a story of segregation, out mobility or something that, you know, if you know, I was trying to figure out what's your main story here. It's this graph seems to suggest that there's something about tribal lands. And it could be, you know, like if by age, if you look at the effect by age, it seems that you could interpret that as, you know, people getting out of tribal lands and then, you know, out mobility or something. Something about, I thought that maybe, I was trying to figure out if there's a finding here, but maybe in the light of segregation or exclusion or something like that.
I think you, for the presentation, I found these really hard to follow. Some of your graphs, there's just too much on one of them. So I would focus, what's your main story? Is it that, you know, they speak education? Is it that?
What's your main story?
Yeah, what's the main story? I'm not getting.
I guess I'm not really clear on it. I think the main story is that what we would assume is associated with disability for the American Indian Alaska Native population isn't necessarily what's happening.
Well, I thought that you set it up as, why is it Native Americans have higher disability than other race lineage? When I look at this graph, I don't really get that story. So what about looking at, you know, first you have a model that shows Native Americans and all others, right? Then you're gonna try to explain it. Maybe you control for age. Is there enacts the Native Americans law. Then if you control for sex and you control for your explanatory factors, what happens to that racial difference? I mean, that I thought was your first question.
So like, sorry,
No, none of this.
like this or no?
Yeah, but I think.
Yeah, you can have, so your first
I would
question
make-
can be comparison with other groups, and then variation within Asian Americans, which I thought that the tribal meaning was interesting, in variation within the group.
I might not present it this way, I might have like bar charts or something.
Okay.
And see how much the lines and then maybe there are some accents between the race and some of your explanatory. But this, I think it's hard to capture.
It's true that you have a lot of results actually on that slide, now that I'm looking back at it.
It's very,
And-
that's the story.
And yet, and you could spend a lot of time on that one, and the other ones are just some
Yeah.
elaborations on trying to understand what's going on.
But it got very confusing.
Because this, you spend very little time.
And this was sort of your main question.
Hmm.
What is the baseline model? What is the baseline and what are plus controls? I don't know about any all control.
No, that was just the region year and stuff.
So we can talk about it, but I would, then this would be your main story for the present. Then you could see whether the controlling for tribal lands doesn't do much. So that it's not the way I could then.
If I can add just a small comment. I think you presented first the age specific rates and then the age standardized, but that sort of like revealed. Like you started by saying, oh, maybe this is explained by age, but we already saw age, so we knew that because they have a disadvantage at all ages, ages cannot be like why we see a disadvantage. So maybe I would do the opposite, so people are more like sort of marveled.
And then the only little thing I would say is that I think you could streamline the front end, the literature review a little bit. Like you had this really great moment where you said, for all these reasons, I decided to, and then you like listed what you were including. I think if you like reorganized it to say like, I'm including these things, like these are the important aims, these are the goals of the analysis, and here's the literature that supports why I'm doing that. You could kind of switch the order of how you did that, because I think you kind of went through this literature in a way that didn't feel super organized until you then summarize it at the end. And I think that would help to just kind of streamline that conversation to be like, you know, this is my goal, these are my aims, and here's the literature to support it, and then be able to spend more time on the results.
Can I make a quick suggestion?
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting if you need to frame the paper as something of a puzzle, because what's going on here is none of the covariates really explain much of the gap. You go from like 1.9 in the odds ratio to 1.6. I mean, it's relatively small. So maybe one thing you could just say is that there's actually a major puzzle at the end of this story, and that it's something for future research to dig into. That could be a convenient way to frame all of this and organize the work that you've done, which I think is great. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
All right, thank you, Gwynne. So, Katelyn, do you have a time constraint, or no, you can all stay until 2, okay, all right, so, Eugenio next time. So a lot of people speak.
I do.
Yeah, I think people have classes. A lot of people have classes at 1:30.
Yeah, you can.
These are flash, so you can find this.
Oh, okay.
And there's like. No, I didn't. So the idea is for this one, there's like a companion poster So you do your 5 minutes presentation and then people can come. Hello everyone. In this very short presentation, I'm gonna illustrate a new decomposition technique to estimate group-specific contributions to life table functions. The goal, as I said, is to develop a new decomposition technique which tries to estimate the contribution of different population subgroups to any life table function. And it's sort of a very general technique, so you don't need to like focus on life expectancy or anything else. It can be a general function. And then I'm gonna show how this sort of decomposition technique can be used, and the application will be try to understand how different counties in the rural-urban continuum in the United States are contributing to the national life expectancy. Just a bit of background. While there are many general decomposition techniques available, very few focus on this kind of problem where you have different subgroups of the population and you want to understand how each one is contributing to some life table function. It is true that you can adjust some of these techniques to sort of solve this kind of problem, but it turns out it's computationally very inefficient, especially when you're trying to estimate more complicated function and you can think of like a life table where you want to do some smoothing, old age extrapolation, and it turns out that the more general techniques are very slow. Here, it's sort of a formal take on it. We are starting from a total population. You can think of the US population. Then we have some subgroups and a baseline population. In the example we're going to see later, the baseline population will be large central metros. The different groups are all the other rural-urban codes, so large fringe metros, medium and small metros, and the total population is just the US population. And we want to decompose the difference between a life table function for the total population, LT, and the baseline population, here large central metros, into group-specific contributions. So basically we want to say, for example, how much of this difference is explained by medium and small metros or large fringe metros, and we want to do this kind of decomposition. The decomposition itself is a bit complicated. You can come see the poster for more details, but the idea is that, and maybe I can explain this graphically, it's a bit easier. We have different ways of adding a subpopulation to our baseline population. We can add it as the first group. We can add it at the first group with another group in the middle. We can add it as the third group, and we can exchange the orders in which we do this. And every time we will have a different result. So it's not just possible to like ignore these differences. You need to compute each of these possible contributions and then weight them up. And the like formal proof of the decomposition, which is in the paper, shows that with appropriate weights, you can get this to sum to the total difference, which is basically the equation I have in the bottom of this slide. And this is how it works in practice and like what you can get out of this. Here, each bar represents an age-specific contribution and is divided into the different groups. And so here, for example, we can see that when we take large central metros as the baseline, because they have a higher life expectancy than most other type of counties, the other counties are contributing negatively, which means that the national life expectancy is lower than the life expectancy for large central metros alone. And you can decompose this by age, but now you can also decompose it by group. And so you can understand how each different type of counties is contributing to this total difference. And here, for example, you can see that large fringe metros have a disadvantage at some ages, but are contributing positively as other ages. And you can see how sort of the different areas are contributing. And sort of like, why are we doing this rather than using other techniques? The advantage is that it's computationally very fast. Here, for this sort of more complicated setting, is 42 times faster than running the Oriucci line integral decomposition. And the sort of the advantage in this case is minimized. In this case, is minimized. But if you don't need age, this is even more efficient. And if you are trying to do a more complicated life table estimation, this becomes again computationally more efficient. Come see the poster.
Can you go back to the intuition slide? Because you kind of skipped over that. I don't know if,
I don't know if I should have it or not.
yeah,
Because it sort of repeats his idea, but then Jose pointed out that graphically, maybe it's a little bit easier. So maybe if I skip this one and I just goes to this one, I can have a little more time to explain it again.
yeah,
On the other hand, I think it's important to say, why do you care about having this kind of thing?
yeah.
You know, so somebody who is not just looking at the equations and doing all that stuff, it's like, why do I care?
Yeah, I would almost like try to bring that up to earlier in the, because I feel like you hit that at the end as like the finale, but I feel like just making that argument straight up would be compelling.
Maybe here,
Yeah,
or even just here, do a little bit more focus on like why.
yeah, like what's the advantage, right? Like what is this bringing to the table? I think that would be good.
So you could say that, you know, US, the example that you use, you could say US life expectancy is the average of all these various components, metro, non-metro. And we would want to estimate how each group contributes to the overall life expectancy. And with this technique, you can answer that question. What's the size of each of those contributions? And with this technique, you can have multiple, it's fast, but we can answer that type of question. Like maybe say what kind of question, what kind of question you can answer with this technique.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea. So the basic intuition is that you're doing Gaussian permutation by including or excluding.
Yeah.
This one, I mean, you can just
It's
say
not
that.
very
You
different.
can say that
So
too.
you can say that.
So I think it's, just the last slide. Because, I mean, you say contribution to national life expectancy, yet the baseline is large central metro. Because initially I saw that and I said, how can it be all negative? But,
There's a yeah, I should clarify that there's a baseline.
But why
there a
would you
way?
not say start national life expectancy and how it's contributes like we did with Oregon?
But
By
even
race.
there's a baseline, which
I
is
know.
not the US one.
With the US born, yeah.
Wouldn't the baseline be the national, is there a way to have, because then it may be great to see the positive and they have to sum.
So in ours, it's the
Because the
US.
average, it's true that the average here is going to be somewhere in the middle of these different contributions.
But in the beginning, when, you know, this is just we could either start from the US and take out each of the groups, or you could start from national US and then take out the different foreign bonds, right? Or we could start with the US bond and add in the different foreign bonds.
This is sort of the evolution of that, where you consider all possible permutations and
Yeah,
you
but maybe
get
you
a
could-
consistent set of.
Right, but, so maybe you can say something about that.
Because
You know, to make it intuitively more. So basically what you've done is eliminated the need to go both ways, is that right?
No, is that, like in a general case, you can think of it in sort of two ways. You start from a baseline and you add, or you start from the total and you remove.
Yeah, right.
But if you just consider the two extreme cases and you average them, it's not like you will not get the correct results because the averaging the two, it's sort of a concave function. So you get results which are a bit off. And I initially thought that like doing all the permutation would be too inefficient. But here the calculations are actually very fast because you just need to compute your life table once.
Well.
And so like it's feasible to do it this way.
And the point about fastness of computation, that's the only difference. The result will be exactly the same.
Exactly the same. Surprisingly,
Okay.
you get the same results as origin,
So
which is
you,
based on totally different.
Did
so,
you try Dasgupta classic decomposition technique as well?
No, I tried the Caswell one, the life table response experiment. Stepwise doesn't work, but just because this is very similar to the stepwise. But the stepwise is usually implemented, you just go one direction and then the opposite direction.
which is what
But
we
here
do.
it doesn't.
I think you could also then make it, I mean, I know you say it's the same, but
Yeah.
you know, so, okay,
I have to say
This
that
is the
in the
question,
poster,
this
there
answer,
is more.
this kind of question, it gives the same results as the previous method that's more computationally
Sort of the
difficult
complicated
and
part there is
motivated.
that I don't think is particularly intuitive how you would adjust Oriucci to do this kind of computation. Because the point is that like Oriucci, you have a function that spits something out. And so here you need to write a function which takes a huge vector with all the number of deaths by age and group and the population by age and group. And like from that you calculate just one total life expectancy. But you have to explain that it's like with the poster, if someone
I
asks.
think we need to move on,
Yeah, we-
but you might think about. No, it's an interesting question, but. we can move on. But I think it's a motivating.
All right. Let's do- Next is Katelyn. Katelyn, it's a flash session also, I think, okay.
Maybe I can see like composing the difference between US and Central Metro. Contribution to the difference between.
That's a good idea. Yes. So you have 5 minutes or so?
5 minutes.
5 years.
5 minutes, I'm just.
Years?
5 years?
5 years?
5 years.
Wow.
Let's get some more food.
I'll just use it. So mine's also a flash session, so it's gonna be 5 minutes. I don't think I can make it in 5 minutes. So if there's anything you see that I should take out, please let me know. This is my first year paper that I worked on since last year about the behaviors of female marriage migrants in South Korea and how it might be associated with their genital attitudes. So I started this project because there is native migrant fertility differentials in Korea that is small despite migrants coming from in our context and us expecting them to have higher fertility compared to natives. Some studies have even found lower number of children in migrant families or families with migrants versus families with just natives. And I thought we should apply gender equality and fertility framework to the migrant fertility because it's rarely applied to immigrant fertility despite them also being subjected to host society's gender norms. So as you probably all know, gender equality and fertility hypothesis says very low levels of fertility in advanced economies can be attributed to gender equity within the family, remaining low while that outside the family is high. And the societal level gender norms in Korea is something that is dominated by pro-work conservatism, where women's work and dual earner and career model is promoted. So women are facing difficulties combining societal work or work outside the family and domestic work. And also the labor market is structured in a way that perpetuates gender division of domestic work. So even if they wanted to change their the way they do their division of work at the household, the structural aspect constrains them from doing so. So my research question is, are female marriage migrants' gender attitudes related to their fertility behaviors? And the first hypothesis is that female marriage migrants with more egalitarian gender attitudes regarding role of women in society would perceive having children in Korea as more difficult and ends up having fewer or no children. And second hypothesis is that mothers with more egalitarian gender attitudes regarding role of men in private sphere would perceive having children in Korea as less difficult and then have more children. So to this end, I used National Survey of Multicultural Families 2018, which is the most recent publicly available nationally representative survey of multicultural families. Multicultural families are essentially families composed of at least one foreign-born person and a Korean person. And this is basically the most common form of migration to Korea for females. This is the only survey that includes information about gender attitudes and family composition of immigrant women in Korea. And I use multinomial logistic regression because my dependent variable is very skewed. I estimate the number of children that each woman have, and the dependent variable is highly right skewed, and only 8% has about 3 or more children. And 75.5% of the sample has at least one child in my sample. And the examples that I use are 4 different dimensions of egalitarian attitudes regarding women's work and childcare. It is measured on a 4-point scale, and all the correlations are below 0.3 and cannot be combined into a single scale. So these are indeed multidimensional aspects of gender role attitudes. Women can prioritize work over childcare, women should work and do not have to be the breadwinner, and that men can take care of their variables that I'm interested in looking at. And I also include controls for household and migrant characteristics, as well as the spouse characteristics. The main findings is that if we look at whether women can prioritize, or agreeing that women can prioritize work has influence on the probability of having children, we see that probability of having more children increases as you agree more to the statement. So more egalitarian attitude is related to fewer number of children, or lower probability of having no children in the case of the blue line. And for 1, 2, or 3 or more children, as we can see with the downward slope, the probability decreases. If we move on to whether women should work or not, this variable was not significantly related. And same with whether men do not need to be the sole breadwinner of the family, this is not significantly related. My last variable, that men can take care of children, also had some significant relationship, but not across all 3 levels of the dependent variable. And it was only significant when comparing between 0 child and 1 child. So if we actually look at the predicted probabilities too, it is only between strongly disagree among no child, and then strongly agree between no child that has significant difference between the predicted probabilities. And so in summary, some dimensions of gender role attitudes are indeed associated with immigrant women's fertility behaviors in Korea, specifically agreement with not prioritizing women's caregiving role over career, a significant negative association with the autumn value of children, and belief in men's ability to take care of children without any help was associated with higher odds of having 1 child versus 0, but not for higher order births. Immigrant women with more egalitarian gender role attitudes seems to also face more difficulty in reaching higher parity in Korea. So the societal norm has implications for fertility of not only the native women, but also immigrant women. And we see that essentialist gender norms are pervasive in this context. So without changes in this kind of broader context, immigration might not be the solution to the population crisis, at least in terms of boosting the fertility rate, as the policymakers were hoping.
1 minute and more than. Questions, comments? So I think, for a flash session, it's a very different kind of format. What you did is like a compressed version of a paper, a presentation of a paper. The flash, you only want to tease people to come see you at your poster. So it's a very different format. You don't need to do like model 1, model 2. You really need to focus on the results, the motivation, and come see me for more details.
Yeah, can you go back to the slide? Well, I wonder if you want to highlight like the main finding and not go through every single finding and say, like, this seems to be the only thing that's not important finding, right? And you could focus on this and say, you have like this one, and then your summary is the same as what you show in the graphs. So you're basically giving a paper in 5 minutes.
I think you could almost just do the summary, say like, kind of preview the findings, right? Like I find that some of there are meaningful differences across some of these dimensions, but not all. And like, I'd love to talk to you about them if you come to my poster or something kind of like, I don't know. I don't know if you want to like
remove the figures from.
It's potentially, but I don't know, then that's a lot of words.
We saw a lot of salesmanship at the Max Planck where they would only say, if you want to know my amazing findings, come see my poster.
That's true, that's maybe not.
So that's us.
Maybe focus on what's the main question that you want to investigate, because you had a lot of back, and you go to
The background, maybe you can,
can be shortened, I think.
yeah.
That's like a lot of stuff on a slide. I would say what's the main question of this paper? Yeah, maybe you just see this is what I'm looking.
Yeah,
And then immigrant women, and you say migrants, but I would put immigrants here, because first I was like, are these internal migrants or are they immigrants?
yeah, that's true.
So you could say female marriage,
Foreign born.
foreign born or something, yeah. Female marriage in migrants, gender role attitudes. Gender role attitudes of female immigrants.
You really should not have more than 5 slides. I
Yeah.
mean, 6 with your titles.
I think
That's the rule.
read all of that back.
Sessions are
This is my research question.
I didn't know how to compress it into 5 minutes, so I just like pushed everything.
Yeah, well, we're giving you suggestions.
But it's not, it's about elimination of the section.
Yeah, right.
You don't show it all.
You don't show it all.
The two
Right.
one you are skipping, you can remove, maybe not. The two figures that she's skipping, maybe just get rid of them.
But like have, not the whole background. Just what's the.
I mean, you could say like these matter across some dimensions versus not. For example, show the one with the biggest differences, and then show one that doesn't have a difference. And then I like to see what else, or I explored this across these other dimensions, come talk to me type of thing. But you could like preview the fact that you have this, right? Like certain dimensions matter, certain dimensions don't. For example, show 2 findings and then come talk to me for the rest, maybe, I don't know. Flash sessions are hard.
Cookies.
Okay.
All right. Regular session?
This is a regular, so.
How much time?
You know, I don't know. I'm assuming 12. I have not heard yet. So I'm assuming 12 based on how many people are attending the session.
It's the super to get people to see your poster, that they did this flash. Because you're living. Oh, I compress my bro with fucking thing. No.
Thank you, everyone who has stuck. Okay, so hello, everyone. My name is Anneliese. I am presenting today on a study that looks at variation in the county level relationship between jail rates and mortality across the United States. So many of us have seen visuals like this that show the steep rise in mass incarceration in the United States. To this day, on any given day, you can still find an average of 2 million Americans sitting in prisons and jails across the country. The widespread reach of the carceral system is increasingly recognized as a population health issue, with a majority of this work focusing on the relationship at a micro level. So really looking at the health repercussions of incarceration for those who experience it, as well as their loved ones, their partners, and their families. A smaller body of work has emerged in recent years that explores the repercussions of incarceration on the health and well-being of communities and neighborhoods. So this is ecological work that examines the aggregate relationship between incarceration and mortality by using places as the unit of analysis. Theorizing this relationship as operating both through kind of these micro-level processes in the aggregate, as well as through distinct meso-level processes. I lay out a framework in my paper that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here, but these can include kind of the disruption of labor markets and social networks, processes of territorial stigmatization and community disinvestment that could come with high levels of carceral activity in an area. So this literature has begun to point to incarceration as an important but relatively neglected factor in contouring an unequal landscape of health and mortality in the United States. Yet a few key gaps in this literature remain that I try to address with this study. First, local jail contacts remain strikingly understudied in this literature. Historically, much of the research on incarceration has centered state-level data, either focusing exclusively on state imprisonment or conflating prison and jail settings, both empirically and in theories. However, because it's the local level where these policies are enforced and where contact is most commonly experienced, ecological studies have recently begun to narrow the frame of analysis to more local levels, such as counties or census tracts. Yet at the same time, very few of these exclusively focus on jail settings. I argue that this is a limitation of the literature for a few key reasons. First, jail incarceration has risen steeply alongside the rise of imprisonment in the United States. And although criminal justice policy is set at the state level, these policies are enforced at local levels, and their research has shown a great deal of variation in incarceration rates and policing practices across more local jurisdictions. Additionally, there might be key differences between prison and jail exposures that might make a difference for health. So because stays in prisons are longer, the largest share of the incarceration population resides in prisons. But contact with jails is much more common. Nearly everyone who enters a state prison does so through a jail context. In the US, there are over 10 million admissions into jails every year, as compared to 600,000 into prisons. Because jails act as temporary holding facilities, they have much higher rates of turnover. So this may present a type of instability less common in long-term facilities like state prisons. Research has shown that jail facilities are characterized by more unpredictability and uncertainty in their daily routines. These different aspects may impose, not paying attention to this. Sorry, here we go. These aspects may impose impose unique challenges on those incarcerated in jails as well as their families. Therefore, even though the exposures to jail may be shorter or more local, minimizing harm, it's also possible that the effects of widespread and repeated contact with jails in the aggregate are both substantial and potentially even distinct from the effects of prison incarceration. Something that is thus far gone largely unexplored in the literature because of the conflation of the under this incarceration umbrella. Another key limitation of the existing literature is that there has been little focus on how the relationship between incarceration and mortality varies by race, sex, and age. This is despite what we know about inequalities in incarceration, where the burden is concentrated among those who are young, male, and Black. No prior work has looked at variation at the intersection of these axes at the county level. Though prior work had either looking at one of these axes or looking at the state level at prisons, provides evidence that these relationships are highly likely to be patterned by race, sex, and age. Additionally, when considering racial variation in prior studies have generally used these race-neutral measures of exposure to incarceration. So, for example, jail rates for the total population, rather than race-specific measures. Despite the fact that we know that exposures to incarceration within areas, even within something like counties, is deeply racialized due to both racial segregation and racism that's embedded in surveillance and policing practices. So this study has two aims. The first is to estimate how county-level associations between jail rates and mortality vary at the intersection of race, sex, and age for Black and white populations. The second is to explore how racial inequalities in jail exposure might mediate this relationship by testing race-specific measures of jail incarceration against these race-neutral measures used traditionally in the literature. So using restricted vital statistics data from the NCHS, I calculate county-level death rates by race, sex, and age across 2 5-year pooled periods over the last decade. The key exposures in this analysis are race-specific jail rate and jail rate for the total population. These are drawn from the Vera Institute of Justice, which draws on the Bureau of Justice's census and annual survey of jails. In adjusted models, I include a number of county-level risk factors which may confound the relationship between jail rates and mortality. These include crime rates, socioeconomic disadvantage indicators, as well as some population characteristics. All exposures and covariates are measured to allow for a 1-year time lag to ensure the temporal ordering of these relationships. Analyses are run on a restricted sample of counties where there is a large enough population, number one, to reliably estimate mortality, but also to compare associations across population subgroups. This analytic sample is representative of nearly 95% of the national Black population, as well as 76% of the white population. So to estimate these relationships, I use negative binomial models as described here. I run these separately by race, sex group, as well as in broad life course stage age groups. So this spans from early life ages 0 to 19 to older ages 65 plus. All models include time period and state fixed effects, as well as an age-specific intercept for each 5-year age group within these broader life course stages. Moving on to some key findings, focusing on adjusted models, I find that county level jail rates, net of other explanatory factors, are statistically and positively associated with increases in mortality, such that a 1 standard deviation increase in race-specific jail rates are associated with between a 1.4 and a 1.9% increase in all age mortality. Positive associations appear across nearly all age groups, for the formatting here, with the exception of insignificant negative associations among men at younger ages, which is somewhat consistent with findings in prison literature. Above age 35, however, we do find positive significant associations, with the size of the associations peaking in late adulthood, ages 50 to 64, at around 3% for all groups. So to look a little bit more at the varying patterns in these associations by race, sex, and age, here what we're looking at are the race and sex ratios of associations across age groups. So above the line in panel A shows you where we have larger associations among Black populations relative to white, and in panel B among male populations relative to female. So a few key patterns emerge. Consistent with prior literature at the state level, we actually find more marked penalties among female populations relative to their male peers across most age groups. But we also find a notably pronounced penalty for Black men at the oldest ages, 65 plus, with statistically larger increases in mortality associated with increases in jail rates, around double that which is experienced by their peers. Another way to quantify the mortality toll associated with jail rates is offered here. So this shows the model predicted mortality rates from the adjusted models, demonstrating how an age group specific death rate would be expected to change in 2 hypothetical scenarios. One in which the individuals live in a county where there is no jail incarceration, and one in which there are high levels of jail incarceration corresponding to the 99th percentile in the sample. This figure shows the unique age pattern documented among Black men across age groups, with marginal decreases in young adulthood, followed by a growing disadvantage into later ages, driven by the coupling of an increasing penalty of jail incarceration on already high levels of mortality. Black men after the age of 35 face the steepest mortality toll associated with living in high jail areas. By the oldest ages, the cost of moving from a no jail area to one in which there is high levels of jail exposure is over 450 Black male lives per 100,000, a toll that is 2 times higher than that of their peers. Finally, in the secondary analysis, I test race-neutral measures of jail incarceration traditionally used in the literature against these race-specific jail exposures that I use in the study here. What can be seen here is that conventional race-neutral measures, shown in white, underestimate the magnitude of the association for both Black and white individuals across nearly every age-sex combination, suggesting that some of the degree of harm that's associated with incarceration might be masked in prior literature by not considering the racialized nature of exposure to jail. Of course, the study does not come without limitations, including all those that are generally associated with ecological work. Given my lack of individual level data, all the estimates here should be interpreted solely as associations rather than causal relationships. Further, jail rates are only available at the county level by race. So I'm unable to empirically distinguish between the direct and spillover relationships that I'm talking about here. However, I draw on well-documented disparities in incarceration to discuss the likely nature of these relationships. Further, I make a series of analytical decisions, for example, around the population threshold, time lags, covariate specifications, all of which could have potential implications for the interpretability of the results, but I do include a variety of robustness checks. With little change to results, I'm happy to discuss this more in the Q&A. So I believe that this study contributes to the broader literature on why even misdemeanors might matter for population health and mortality. In particular, I find evidence suggestive of the collateral associated with even lower level jail rates, particularly among women, as well as the heavy burden that falls on Black men, particularly later in life. This research calls attention to the need for future work to disentangle jail and prison settings in both our theoretical and empirical understandings, to consider the demographic distribution of harm, and to incorporate racialized measures of incarceration exposure so that we may better capture the full scope of harm associated with the vast reach of America's carceral state. I look forward to hearing your questions.
So you were, I mean, you had, could have done 1 more minute.
Okay, great.
We'll see.
Talking very fast.
Questions.
Can you go back to the slide with the beginning, that one, it's a little bit, it's small, so it's
Yeah,
very hard to see.
Okay.
Can maybe figure
I-
out,
Yeah.
but I, you know, we can talk it.
You're not really spending
Yeah.
time.
So is that?
She reduced the text in the books.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy enough to make the text a little bit bigger. I just,
It's gonna be a bit distracting though, because then people are gonna try to read a lot.
So,
So maybe.
So you can remove the content of the boxes, just keep material, economics, social,
Mhm.
functional, communal.
oh, interesting, yeah. Kind of like create a simplified version.
yeah, simplified version.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And then you say you have framework in your paper, but you're not gonna talk about it, so. Why would you show this one instead of yours?
This is mine. So this is adapted, so I adapt it from prior.
Okay, I thought you had, the way you framed it.
I see.
Sound, the way you said it, it sounded like, oh, I have another one.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it. This framework, which I laid out in or something, I'm making.
Yeah, right,
fair.
because it sounded I have more detailed framework.
Got it. Yeah, yeah.
You would say, I elaborate on this particular framework.
Okay.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
It sounded to me like you had another one.
A different one.
And
No, no,
this
no.
was just shown because other people said.
Got it. Okay.
So maybe you can simplify and then make it clear that you expand on this particular.
Yeah.
Framework.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Thank you.
Can you go to the graph with the ratios?
Sorry, that got all
The-
messed up in here.
Yeah,
I need-
here I got a bit lost.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't really know why.
So that's black, white, so that anything under one means that whites have lower rates? I don't know.
Yeah, so basically, and I tried to, but because I talk so fast, I probably was not very clear, but basically anything above the line in panel A shows where Black populations have larger associations than white populations, so below the line would be larger white versus Black. Same thing on panel B.
Right, mortality ratios.
These are mortality, these are
To write
mortality.
mortality somewhere on the
Yeah,
slide.
I think
Yeah.
so.
Mhm.
You say black and white ratio, so maybe you can have a title there.
Yeah,
Fine. So title that sort of explains
yes,
the ratio of
mortality
black to white,
ratios.
black to white ratio.
Of the effect of the
Yeah,
The association.
it's the association, yeah, so it's the association between incarceration.
And then you say anything below the line says that the whites have higher rates.
Yeah, I could almost add like a little, sort of little tiny, like a bubble here that explains that. so
Yeah,
it's
maybe,
clear.
because that might be, because I think people would expect the ratio to have bigger impact on blacks than whites.
Yes, yeah,
I think that might be the.
yeah. And part of that is because I standardize, yeah, it gets complicated, but part of that is because I standardize the jail rates, race-specific jail rates, like within racial groups. But anyways,
So is this based on within race?
yes, these are race-specific associations.
Okay, I think you want to make that.
Okay.
The other confusing thing are the colors, because like in one, they are male, female, male,
Yeah,
and the other one, they are, like I was trying hard to understand.
yes, this is me
Yeah.
trying to avoid paying for colors in my.
Very good.
But I can do color.
Never pay for the colors.
Yeah, you can have.
I can have color.
It's pretty.
Yeah,
When you publish, you have to pay a lot of money.
I know, so, but you're right, I can do different colors here because it is comparing. Right,
You can do
it's confusing, yeah.
Per figure, huh? Like 300.
One graph which I thought was extremely compelling was the depicted.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that protective
Even
effects
the
of
one-
jail is no agent is well known in the literature.
Even
So they
John
overall,
must
I
have
think you might want to spell out little more theory where your distribution is relative to what you're able to know.
Got it.
You do have a lot of contribution.
Got it, yeah,
But by saying here and there, you know,
Similar.
already know, then we kind of lose what's your actual contribution is, and I think since you do have a lot of specific contribution, I think you wanna
okay.
stress that, and not shy away from saying this is my contribution,
Mhm.
but I think you have it already.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely spend more time kind of talking about this hypothetical protective effect in my paper, but I got nervous about time, so I kind of I like focused instead on other findings, but I think that, yeah, I should.
So
Sure, did you read?
why am I having trouble with so the top one is age and the bottom one is it age and race? The top one, I'm a little confused.
Is
about
So
that.
this is so it's it's age group specific death rates, right? So we're looking at death rates across different age groups, and then the colors, the lines are the different race sex groups.
There's only one line.
There's 4 different groups.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm getting confused because you have highlighted the top.
Yes, that's mainly just because I spend
That's what
time
you
talking
spent time
about.
on. Yeah, if you didn't have that, I would feel.
Yeah,
Maybe having a scale on the left and
Yeah.
right.
well, the scale changes
Yeah, but
across age
Yeah.
groups because the scale changes across age
Because
groups
it-
for death rates.
Right.
So I to minimize the amount of numbers on the screen, I pulled them down. Because really I think what I was trying to draw attention to here was more just kind of like changing this distinct age pattern that you see emerge among Black men,
Yeah.
which is really more of like a relative to others, but
You explained it very well, like when you said it, it was very clear. But this red box had me like for a minute think that we were looking like at a graph on top and another graph on the bottom.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think I also
Yeah,
could
that's what I-
instead, yeah, I
Definitely,
could,
right?
remove the
When you had that box, it looked like they were two separate, but it's one graph.
It's just one. The
Yeah.
scale is.
maybe when I'm explaining this graph, I don't have the box there, and then I just bring the box
You
in
put-
when I'm talking.
Yeah,
about it.
but then just explain the graph without the box.
Yeah,
And then when you wanna highlight the black net,
yeah,
then put the box in.
perfect.
And the scale is not broken by age, right? So, so I mean, the distance
Correct.
between 4,010 and 2151 is consistent with the other distances, is that correct? Just to try to see, because otherwise how do you pick the slopes?
No,
Did not.
You could
They're
really
not.
choose any slope you want, then
Because they all at different levels, right?
mhm.
it's consistent.
I think I need to go back, I have to go back and
It
look at
looks
what
like
I did.
consistent, which is a good thing, because otherwise people could say, well, you can.
Yeah. But I think that's something to check. I need to go back and look at what I did.
Well, it's just the rate, it's just like high and versus low.
But there's no GL ratio.
And we didn't
Across
graph
the
the
entire,
consistent, but not between.
all the groups is consistent, it seems, that's important.
I think so. I'll double check that. That's a really good point. I need to check what I did when I made this.
Maybe you could
The other one's
fix,
not, like we do
like fix the range, like you move them up and down, but you fix the,
Yeah.
like it's always between X and X plus 200 for all ages. But then you move X up and down because the mortality
Yeah.
changes. And that I think addresses the fact that otherwise the slopes, you could make whatever you want.
Yeah.
But they are all different levels.
I mean, the reality is like you get,
One
And
slope,
sex, and
one
sex.
slope per age. Or one
Yeah.
scale per age. Which you should.
yes. I see what you're
Just
saying.
double check.
Yeah,
So
I
so
think,
if you go down the road,
Yeah.
I mean, down the column.
They're not broken.
within each age group is what you're
Within each
saying.
age
Yeah, no, nothing's broken within each age group, but
Not the same slope.
it's not.
I mean, the point is
Compare
that you
across
cannot
age group,
really.
they are different.
You cannot really know if blacks in the last age groups are steeper than blacks in another age group.
No.
Just
you can
from
only
looking at
compare
these, you can only compare with them.
You can only compare within age groups. If I would have to put them, yes, that's exactly right. So you can't do any comparison here across age groups.
No.
You can only do, this is basically just looking at the ordering within age groups of
Ordering
race sex
within
groups.
these groups.
But I can make that like a
And do per
lot
group.
clearer. Got it.
Ordering
The
within- ordering
direction, the age
within
or the
the-
direction.
Exactly.
Right, but not the. So,
Exactly. Okay, that's something I can make for.
and then we've been able to.
Check the other
order-
suite,
No,
figures with the age.
emails, if you like.
No.
They approve by law, and then in the other,
Depends.
so the ordering doesn't stay the same.
No, it doesn't. Which is something I definitely talk about this figure a lot. I just had to, I don't know where to cut, but talk about. The presentation. Great. That's really helpful.
Okay, all right, well, thanks for staying until 2:15, so really great. So you have another 10 days to so you're in a good shape. All right.
Thank you.
Very good.
It's like, I forget to breathe when I'm speaking, which I do normally anyway. I have to email Courtney's in my second. I feel like I must have missed the email. About how long, and I'm like, if they, then I don't know what I'm. I think I'll have to just cut something. I think, well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because we are.
Yeah, but did you see how fast I was speaking and reading? And I don't want to read.
But
you speak very
naturally.
Thank you.
Another thing to like. Yeah, I think the pandemic really changed the dynamic, so for the future. You know, the meeting.
Maybe. That works, that's what I like, me out my leg and.
Yeah, I have some glasses, Nina did that something. Even coming. So that we can keep together.
All right, let me close everything.
Exactly.